Good morning, folks, and welcome to Friday Chunk Talk. My name is Martin. I'm your host and your moderator for today, and this morning's topic is part 2, building off of last week for a continued invitation to the inner world, with today's focus more on coping mechanisms and bias. Today, we're joined again by our fabulous duo from last week and two of my colleagues. We have the wonderful and ultra-talented Jennifer Greenwood and the wise and contemplative Rabbi Yoni Meadows.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I hear you. It's a little laughable. So today's format will mirror. I'm just joking. I love you, Yoni.
And we begin.
I love you. Today's format's going to mirror last week. So you can jump in, ask questions, unmute, put something in the chat, whatever you'd like. So Yoni,
Yeah.
Jen, we're grateful for your time
Yes.
with us today, and we hand the mic over to you two.
Thank you so much. Absolutely feel free to put questions in the chat, but also feel free to just unmute and join the fray. Since it's probably easier for us to just have people unmute and ask than for us to reach down and check chat. So good morning, everybody. So Jen and I and Marty talking about today, our vision is to get a little more concentrated. Last week was lots of big, beautiful brushstrokes of talking about psychodynamic psychology, depth psychology in general. Today, we're going to be talking about coping mechanisms, but also connecting the concept of biases. And especially the coping mechanism we're going to be zeroing in on, projection, connects really very well to bias. And Marty's going to be sharing a case that he has in where bias came up as an issue. So today we're trying to drill down and to make this a little bit more on the ground and practical. So just to begin, when we talk about coping mechanisms, and I think coping mechanism is one of those terms that people use but might not necessarily know what it means.
Mm-hmm.
And in the language of psychodynamic psychology, the psychoanalytic tradition, coping mechanism, first and foremost, is not a pejorative term. It's not a criticism, it's not a critique, it's not bad, as is so many things in psychology. To look at things simply as being what they are, as opposed to a judgment of whether this is good or bad, I think is very helpful. So, and I'm just going to give some quick definition of coping mechanisms. Jen, please jump in.
Yes.
But essentially, coping mechanisms are a natural part of life and part of how all of us survive, especially in childhood. That we as human beings, as living, breathing, feeling, emotional, affective with an A, human beings encounter experiences throughout the course of our lifetimes. And unconsciously, we encounter experiences that our heart, mind, and soul make assessments and decisions without asking our conscious mind or ego, whether or not we can handle that in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I always liken it to a colander, that when we make pasta, you're taking a big pot of boiling water and pasta, and you want the pasta, but you also don't want a trip to the emergency room. So instead of reaching and grabbing the pasta, you're pouring the water and the pasta out, keeping the pasta, the water goes through. So our heart, mind, and soul is saying, we're going to make decisions as to what is going to stay in the conscious mind, and the rest of it goes into our subconscious, into our unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't go away. However, it, at least for that time period, is something we're not actively contending with.
Mm-hmm.
Coping mechanisms are the individual ways that our heart, mind, and soul essentially compartmentalizes reality and gives us tools to cope with what we are doing in life. Again, I want to emphasize, this is not a weakness or bad. This is something that we all do, and if we didn't do, we wouldn't be able to live our lives.
Mhm. And this all starts, we learn these coping mechanisms as we grow as children. We learn them from our parents, guardians, people influential in our lives, and they're stored up here. As professionals, and we start to bring them out and utilize them with our families, with our patients. And sometimes they pose as kind of a trigger for us, where something, how someone is acting, something said, kind of sets us back to when we were that little kid. Like I've been listening to a lot of different talks on the subject, and I can see him too growing up and Yoni and I were talking about this morning, that in our American culture, we grow up to be hopeful, be kind, and to be nice to other people. And sometimes we aren't so nice, and sometimes a little bit of a bully. And that's where that all stems from our childhood. And so I know my kids will eventually use this as, Mom, this is your fault. Like they already do as teenagers, but I have tried to teach them all the right things to prepare them for this world, so they're not using and projecting onto people from when they were 5, when I was yelling at them for something that they did, and I'm moving forward. And so they're not, it's not such a fight or flight kind of, and they're fighting for their survival, which brings us to the coping and defense mechanisms that we've been discussing. So our defenses ultimately is something that we do to protect ourselves. No one likes hurting other people, usually intentionally. Sometimes in our subconscious, though, that comes out in our words, our nonverbal behavior, sometimes in our verbal behavior. So one of the, I guess, when I'm meeting with patients, is I'm very mindful of how I'm reacting facially. Through sometimes I am a hand talker, and I know that. So I try to put my hands down. And this has all come from experiences and working too with other colleagues of just how to be more efficient, more productive in working and relating to with our patients and our families. Sometimes that can be really difficult. And we can't get on the same page. We get frustrated. The medical team gets frustrated. We're trying to understand, but there's something that is holding us back. And so that's where learning from our experiences in these different coping mechanisms, so we can move forward to really be present and helpful to our patients and their families.
So some points to really remember is that, first of all, every person has their own, there are many coping mechanisms, and each person has their own, their own list, their own collection, and no two people are the same. The vast majority of this is unconscious. We do not choose to do it. It is something that we have been hardwired for survival to do this. And again, this can not only be not negative, it can be absolutely essential for survival. However, something that I see constantly in chaplain education and in chaplaincy itself is what I've come to understand as a truism, that the coping mechanism that we utilize unconsciously at, let's say, when we're 8 years old, can be exactly one of the most difficult obstacles to our continued psychological, spiritual growth when we're at a different stage of life, let's say 48. So a simple example, at 8 years old, let's say, what was always modeled for you and your family and what you learned unconsciously and consciously was to not access very readily your emotions, because when you did that, because of your childhood experiences, that was painful, and you felt like there was nothing you could do about it, and that was frightening, so you didn't do that. So that enabled you to at least muddle through as an 8-year-old by essentially splitting off, term, sort of moving aside and distancing yourself from your emotional self. Okay, now, but let's fast forward into, let's say now you're in your 40s. Let's say you have a spouse and you have a family. Let's say that you're in a helping profession and a healthcare profession where it's important that you try to understand the person you're providing care for. If you have never had modeled for you to access your emotions, and if that's how you survived, was staying away from them, it is very difficult, and I would say impossible, to do it by accident. It has to be a conscious choice to do or live differently, to then move into a different way of being. So,
and I think too, I know at the end of the day, I take some time to self-reflect of the patients that I've seen, the things that I liked, the things that I can tweak and do better, just to try to process some of that, even on the way home. Like sometimes I leave things at the office and my processing on the way home is belting really bad singing in my own car. And for me,
very bad, very, very.
And that's effective for me. So that when I get home, I'm not spewing everything from the day's work onto my family members. Because one, that's not fair. And two, they're confused because I just got home. And why am I crabby?
And a lot of that spewing could be without speaking about it. I mean, that's one of the most difficult things, which brings us, what a great segue, which brings us to the coping mechanism we wanted to focus on today, which is one of the most common and important ones, which is called projection. Projection, very simply, is when we unconsciously take aspects of ourselves and then associate them onto another person without our intending to do it, or without the other person asking if that's okay. So, and it's usually things that we associate as being uncomfortable or negative. I mean, you can have positive projection, but that's less common.
Yes.
So if, for example, if we feel about ourselves that on some level, there is a key, what we understand as a key moral failing, or a key in who we are, we can start seeing that all over the place, and even though they have nothing to do with us, and they are not us. On a large group level, Carl Jung, the psychiatrist, used this to explain mass incidences of prejudice and of bias. As a German-speaking man living in the 20th century, he used it to talk about the Holocaust. That the Holocaust was what he called mass shadow projection of European society, placing that upon the Jews and other people as a way of displacing their own anxieties and their own unconscious negative experiences and perceptions of themselves.
Mhm. And sometimes I think we go into a room. We have, let's say this is a patient, we've heard that they're non-compliant. We've heard that there's a lot of things going on. And I always ask myself, well, what do you mean by non-compliance? Is that because they don't understand the situation? Is it because they're having a hard time coping themselves? When I dig deep down further, it sometimes is the lack of understanding what is going on and their perceptions from one provider is different from the explanation of another provider who came back after I saw them and explained it in a manner that they understood. And so I think it's very important that as providers, we are seeking from our patients and our families, do they understand what we are discussing, what is being talked about? And to reassure them that it's okay that if they don't, that's why we are here. We're here to clarify, define any questions, fears, and that this is going to be like an ongoing and that it just doesn't end right there and right then. Because I think some patients do feel that it's not discussed unless they bring it up. And so it's trying to help our patients be proactive in their discussions. And sometimes as providers, we get overwhelmed. This is our last patient of the day. And we are spent. And so we go in and we try to pretend like this is our first patient of the day and actively listen to what our patients, what do they know? What have they been told? So there isn't such I guess a competitive feeling that someone else is explaining it better than me, or because sometimes that can lead to sometimes the people feeding into their own insecurities of, well, they don't like me. And for some providers, that's important. And for others, they could care less.
And the non-compliance example actually feeds into an even deeper level of projection. It's a subset of projection. This was advanced by Melanie Klein, who was an important psychoanalyst from the Object Relations School. She talked about something called projection, where projection is where I'm unconsciously taking things that I'm uncomfortable with, I see as negative, and I'm placing them on another person. So non-compliance, I have my own complexes about being compliant, about doing the right thing, about being the kind of person that other people expect of me. And then I place all of those attitudes unconsciously on this patient who may or may not be complying with their medical regimen for all sorts of reasons that have nothing to do with us. Projective identification then becomes the person being projected onto, in this case, the patient, experiencing this projection, understanding it, starts believing the projection. The patient starts to see themselves as the projection. So you have an example of, let's say someone is yelling at another person, all you ever try to do is to silence, is to shut me up. And the person that they're yelling at says, well, I don't, I don't do that. I mean, and that's not something I do. And this person keeps yelling at them. The person being yelled at starts to think, well, maybe I really do find this person irritating, and might find themselves yelling at the person to shut up. They become the projection. And that's an even deeper, issue to be unraveled for all of us as providers of care.
And sometimes we don't even realize it.
Most of the time.
And unless we are really thinking about after our visits, or thinking about how the day went, is there any different way we could have handled a person's question, rephrased it, and eventually with time, every opportunity that I have, I try to learn something new from it, how to phrase things differently, because I know I understand things explained a little bit differently than maybe Yoni would. And so from there, I have to remember, I got to go back to patient B tomorrow. And because they seemed confused, but I pick up on that. It's not until we kind of look back, to really kind of reflect on how did that interaction go? And what was their body language? How did they look? And moving from there of, okay, my next visit, what am I going to change to help them? Or maybe was it something that they had heard differently that day that they didn't share with us that made them maybe shut down, not want to talk, not want to say anything? Because while they're here, they're seeing a lot of faces.
So this actually connects really well to a case that Marty, which goes to the whole question of bias. And bias actually fits very nicely in the umbrella of projection, of the challenge for all of us to be aware of everything going on in an encounter in a situation besides what seems to be on the surface. So Marty, if you could share the case.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a real case, but of course the details I've been intentionally vague with to be respectful for privacy, but I think it's something we've all seen and all will identify with. So I'm consulted to meet with a patient that has had a disability since birth, and they're an adult now. They have a guardian, and now they have this new localized cancer that's curable. And the medical team has consulted me because they're recommending hospice. When I talk to the medical team, they talk about disability, they talk about quality of life, but from their own personal perspective. I can still remember hearing them say, but look at him, isn't he suffering? Wouldn't surgery just prolong that suffering? And in palliative care's role in that case, I think really was to help the medical team appreciate and understand what does quality of life mean to that particular patient from their own eyes, right? To give that patient a voice to dispel some of the assumptions and the biases. And I will tell you, after talking with the guardian, it was very much a life worth living. And the guardian argued that this patient's quality of life maybe was arguably better than some of our own. And the last point I wanted to make was that I do believe that after talking with everyone involved, that the medical team's comments about disability and assumed quality of life, I do believe they didn't come from a place of malice. I mean, I genuinely believe they thought they were doing the right thing, but they were wrong, right? They were ignorant, they were biased, and maybe other things. And we in palliative care, I think, help dispel some of that.
So to look at this case, and it's such a great example of what in any human encounter, something, a Hindu concept from the Upanishads that my psychoanalyst, who is a very spiritual and very committed Hindu, taught me, is that the thing as objective reality, in the sense that I think in Western culture, we often think that reality is a free floating existence. And then all of us have our own subjective perceptions, or our own biases. And if only we could just leave those at the door, we would see the truth. And my analyst said there is no such thing. That all of our perceptions not only color this truth, they actually help shape it and help define it. So all of us come to everything looking at ourselves and looking at others with our own point of view. And that is not negative or even positive, it just is. And so to hold up the fact that medical culture in and of itself is its own culture, and there's a tendency in healthcare that to think that, well, this is science. We're just looking at the facts. We're just looking at objective reality. Well, we're not. Everybody comes to this with their own perceptions. Well, what is quality of life? What would be a sensible plan of care? That's projection. You're putting that onto the person as an assumption, well, that any reasonable person would see it that way. When that is, I mean, to begin with culture, but then to even go beyond that, that is simply not the case.
And there's been instances throughout my career working in inner city Jacksonville for a lot of my clinical career, is there was always this assumption made that our homeless patients needed to be placed without asking, are they content with living on the streets? And more often than not, that's where they wanted to be. But it was our own biases and assumptions that were made that they should want better. And they liked it. They had their community of camaraderie within the, that's where they wanted to be. And sometimes it definitely wouldn't be a place for me, but for those people, they were content with how life was and how it is. And so projecting what we think that they should have as a quality of life is very different from person to person. And treating everybody as such, finding what they find as important quality of life will differ from person to person, different cultures.
So with this case, what we're really looking at underlines something that my colleagues on this call involved in clinical pastoral education and chaplain education and chaplaincy is something that we know as being absolutely integral, ground zero to who we are as a profession and what we do, which is that the providers in this case that Marty just elucidated, what they needed to have done was to be curious, first and foremost, with the patient. What is it that you need? What is it that you want? But even preceding that, in order to try to have a clear and accurate and understanding of the patient as possible, we have to be aware of ourselves. So what are our biases in terms of, we'll use using this example, what is our understanding of quality of life and how does that drive the conversation in the plan of care? Not coming at this as I've got to come to the right answer. I have to come to the authentic answer for me so that I'm aware that I'm bringing that like luggage into the room. And then I can come to the patient and say, well, where are you at? Who are you? So we talked about last week, if we don't have understanding of the patient, how are we assessing them? And if we don't understand ourselves, how do we have any confidence that our assessments are actually, I'll use the word accurate of the patient. And these providers came with the assumption that, of course, everyone's going to see it the way they saw it.
Mhm. And especially when you get a whole bunch of providers, it's like everybody bringing their own bags
Mhm.
with them to the patient's door. And they all should be leaving them at the door, but they bring them all in. So this is, this patient is in this hospital bed and everybody's got their own, like one big mountain. And so we don't really, because we're trying to peek through the little,
Yeah, we can't see the mountain.
no, because, there's too much baggage in the. It's kind of like a visual example of really trying to get a true reflection of what patients want. What is, because some notes reflect one thing and others reflect things. And so without, really being there for our patients and advocating like Marty did, maybe this person would have gone to hospice and may have, eventually died or been placed into a nursing care facility, which a lot of people question is that quality of life? So it's a matter of, go ahead, Murray.
No, I didn't. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you in the middle of your train of thought. I wanted to ask you guys, you're hitting home the same theme. It's so important for us to know who we are so we know what baggage we're bringing, because that impacts our ability to understand our patients.
Mhm.
Mhm.
How do we get better at that? Many of us may even just struggle with the basics of identifying who we are and why we are that way. How could you advise us to help us become better at that stage? And then I see Jake has a question. I'll have him go after you answer.
My fellow chaplaincy educator has a question about this. I love it.
Go ahead, Jake.
Okay, yeah, so my question is also a comment. I know for students in CPE, we purport action reflection.
Right.
And so the way that I know I have gotten better at this has been for me to exactly what you were saying earlier, Jen, reflecting on the way home, whether that's in my own thought or simply writing it down. Also writing down like this case, for example, presenting it here is an opportunity to reflect. I'm just internally reflecting on what are my biases and unconscious biases about what it means to be differently abled. And even that title itself carries so many thoughts with it. And so being able to reflect on that is what I encourage my students. So responding to your question, Marty, I encourage, it doesn't matter which discipline you're in, but to reflect and to do the work of reflecting develops that. My question is, I'm wondering if there's specific reflection questions that would be unique to each discipline. That's my question for the presenters. If you've thought about, or if you want to talk more about what it would mean for a chaplain to reflect versus a social worker versus a provider.
That's a great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. I think we'll have to.
Well, I will say that the tasks are going to change discipline to discipline. I do want to say, I'm not trying to sidestep your question, Jake, but I do want to say that our head alone, our cognitive process alone is not going to get us there. So for chaplains, we are taught to always begin with the emotions. we need our heads, we need our intellect, we need our powers of discernment, but so much of our knowing goes much deeper and is much more broad than simply what we perceive with our eyes and grasp with our intellect. So part of how I'd respond to Marty's question, how do we do this? So we elicit the response from the patient. Where are you at? But also we have to go into how are we feeling in the moment, responding to whatever is happening in the moment, and what comes up in us in terms of emotions or awareness or visions. What we become aware of in the moment. It can't just be a cognitive checklist. That's not going to get it done.
Because there are plenty of checklists that we use every day in our assessments, making sure that we have everything and it's put in computer and so forth. But this, I don't think, is just a couple things and it's one and done. I think for me, we got to process with our own peers, our thoughts, feelings. How do we, and put it back on us of, well, how do you feel about that? And being able to, I think the biggest part is being able to open up to someone or a small group of people that you feel comfortable with, that you trust, and giving good feedback. Because I think trust is a huge thing in building, not only with our patients, but in discussing these situations with, because I think that if we don't, we're not going to share our full experience and how we fully feel, because that takes vulnerability. And not a lot of people want to express that because they're not sure how that's going to be received. And
what's coming up in me in the moment is for doctors and nurses, I'm thinking about the practice of timeout before you begin a procedure. The rule of thumb is that if it requires consent, it requires a timeout. Before you begin a procedure, everybody involved in the procedure says, okay, are we sure this is the right patient? Are we sure this is the right procedure? Are we sure that this is what we're supposed to be doing? Well, especially if a lot of your practice involves protocols, involves tasks, then I think broadening the practice of timeout might be a way to go, which would be, okay, not only are we sure that this is the right procedure, but to check within ourselves, check with our colleagues, check with the patient. Do we understand what this, what we're about to do? Do we understand what the implications of what we're about to do? Does this align with what you want, with what your goals of care are? To take the time to look inside of ourselves, but also facilitate response from the patient and from our colleagues. Okay, this is what we were intending on going. Is that really going to get to where the patient wants to go? Does that really make sense? To take that moment to breathe and to reflect.
Jerry has a question in the chat. He was looking for, is there something that people can read or reference to if they either want to go deeper into this, or even just a reminder for them to look back at?
yes.
I'm sure there's a lot, but is
Yeah.
there something in particular that stands out as a particular favorite, or all of Carl Jung's work?
Yeah, pretty much.
Pretty much. Yeah.
Um,
This is the first that I came with thought.
all of Carl Jung's work. You have Robert Boyd's article on small group work and Jung. You have Harry Wilmer's works, Understandable Jung and Practical Jung, which are excellent, which use very understandable. Jake Condrath, feelings as messengers, absolutely. That is a wonderful article from the chaplaincy world of understanding whatever we experience as emotions are not synonymous with the sum total of reality. They're messages to ourselves, to what we need in the moment. And we can deal with those messages. Like we get an email, we can respond to the email right away. Or we can later. So we can decide, how do we respond to the fact we feel angry, sad, confused, whatever it is, but also to understand what do those emotions usually, what needs do they usually point to. Anger, for example, in Condrath, usually points to a violation of boundaries. Why has this happened to me?
Which we see in patients. I see in patients more frequently is they are asking, why me? I didn't do anything.
Mhm.
Why is what they want to know the why. And sometimes that is digging deeper into, well, why are they asking why? Is there some other underlying aspect, memory, trauma that they have gone through? There are numerous scenarios, and I guess that you have to kind of tailor it from one patient to another. And I think it's a great idea to find a colleague that you trust, to reflect on how things went with, if there is something really sticking out or just not feeling right about a patient interaction, to review it and discuss how, okay, this is what I did. And hopefully in thinking about it, you may come up with the answer. They may provide a small bit of the answer, but it shows that you want to improve how you're interacting with patients, which I think is all our goal at
Right.
the end of the day, is to provide the best patient care to our patients with dignity and respect, and within their aligned views and values. We don't have to agree with those views and values,
Right.
but we definitely need to respect them.
Right. Oh, Inner Work by Robert Johnson, extremely readable. It's basically a how-to book on using psychodynamic psychology to more deeply understand yourself. That's a fantastic work. Tom had a number of what looked like really awesome questions. Marty, would you be able to access some of those?
I think my question is, at an individual level, regulation in our agency at that moment defines a lot of these things. And as you mentioned, you make the best judgment at that time. But how does this apply? Okay, one person, one physician, I get it. But let's say you're one physician, you're a manager, and you're managing 1,000 patients. How do these things translate into public health?
So I think this translates into public health quite readily when we look at, for example, Jung's example of shadow projection. He was talking on a societal level. So actually a really good way, or a good place to begin, is the ACE study, if you're familiar. So the concept of the ACE study from Kaiser Permanente in the 90s was this whole idea that they were encountering all of these medical impacts, but not having any understanding of where this was coming from. So it was looking at reality as we see it in front of us, and then being curious and being open and being vulnerable and being on a communal level, on an institutional level. How did we get here? What's first of all, we look at the what, then we start looking at the why. And what are those trends? What is that, what are those causes we can identify? And then how do we address that on an institutional level? The ACE study which has led to enormous changes in healthcare in around the world, I think is actually a phenomenal example of that. Rachel had a question about the title of the Robert Johnson work, Inner Work by Robert Johnson. It's extremely non-jargony, although I love psychological jargon, but it doesn't have a lot of it. Another is The Symbolic Quest by, the name is escaping me. That's more jargony.
Yes, I mean, this is something that we're hoping to carry on into 2023. So this won't be the last you see of this duo.
If Marty and all of you will have us.
Yes, yes.
All right, brilliant. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Yoni. We really appreciate your time with us today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, Marty. Thank you for having us.
Have a great weekend.